Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. God's talking about sacrifice. For I desired mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. There's a lot to be said about all of that. Initially, and I think there's a lot of confusion in the world today. I think there's some people that read that and think God never wanted any sacrifice at all. That even the idea of a sacrifice is now wrong, and it was the devil that wanted the sacrifice. Well, that's a completely confused way of rendering that verse, right? So it can be confusing reading that because we know God's the one who told them to bring the sacrifice. So why would God come and say, I desired mercy, not sacrifice. I desired the knowledge of God and not burnt offerings. Okay, and what I want to say to you is God's not saying that he never desired a sacrifice. As we'll see later, God actually desires a sacrifice more than anything. That's actually the thing that's in his heart to show us the love he has, right? It's actually the thing that's in his heart that will actually cleanse his image in our hearts, that will actually show himself to be our Father, is through a sacrifice. So he's not saying that he never desired a sacrifice. What he's trying to do is he's trying to tell us what the purpose of there being a sacrifice was for. You see, because people's idea of why there was a sacrifice had gotten perverted, right? And people thought that God demanded the sacrifice from the sense that he wanted the people to offer him something, that he demanded sacrifices and offerings for himself. And that's why these sacrifices were in the Old Testament scriptures. And so God has come and said, no, you guys are completely misunderstanding the whole point of what the sacrifice is about. He says the point of the sacrifice is the knowledge of God, right? The point of the sacrifice is for you to know that my heart is filled with loving kindness. That's the whole point of the sacrifices. And so God says, I gave you this sacrificial system, not because I demanded you to make an offering to me, not because I demanded you to come and give me a sacrifice or give me gifts. He said, the reason why I gave the sacrificial offerings is so that you could see that my heart was filled with loving kindness towards you, and you might come to know me. That's the knowledge of God. The whole point of these sacrifices is that you would come to know me. It's about knowing me and the loving kindness in my heart. And you guys think it's about me demanding you give me something. So he comes and making it straight. No, I desired mercy. Mercy there is hesed in the Hebrew, which means loving kindness. And the knowledge of God, not burnt offering. So it wasn't about you making a burnt offering for me. It was about you coming to know the loving kindness in my heart through these sacrificial systems. That's what it was about. You might think, well, how's that? How can we get that out of all that? It's like, are we just supposed to know that? Well, it's difficult to comprehend God when you're busy with the carnal mind, right? But these were the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, and they were steeped in Jewish history and the knowledge of the oral tradition, which means they passed down stories. We pass down stories about Cinderella and Rapunzel, right? We pass down stories about that. Do you know what the little Hebrew children passed down stories by mouth about? They passed down stories about God and Noah and Adam and Eve and Enoch and Abraham. And if they would have mixed their stories about Abraham and Abraham coming and saying, which is even written in their law, God will provide himself a sacrifice, they would have seen all these sacrificial offerings that the law spoke of are actually God prophesying to us that he will provide a lamb. Because it's supposed to say something to you when God comes and offers a sacrifice, and he provides the sacrifice. It's supposed to say something to you about him and what he feels for you, is what it's supposed to do. I promise you, it says something completely different about him if you think he's demanding that you offer the sacrifice, that you make the offering. It says something completely opposite. And it turns the house of Lord into the place that isn't a house of worship anymore. It turns it into a place of robbery because you're not coming there and receiving what the Lord provides for you. And in receiving what the Lord provides for you, you're not finding a righteous offering coming out of you, which you know what the only righteous offering you could ever even give the Lord is? Abba! Into your hands I commit my desire for life. That's the only righteous offering you can even offer God. And that's the reason why the house of God is called a house of worship. Because you walk into the house of God and you see that He didn't ask you to bring the offering. He didn't ask you to prepare the table. He didn't ask you to bring a gift. He's the one who provided Himself as the gift. He provided Himself as the lamb. And you see that on a table in the house of God is a table He prepared. And you see that He provided the life or the meat that could feed you with life onto the table. And when you walk in there and see this God provided you with Himself and you find yourself healed by His life, do you know what comes out of your mouth? A righteous offering. Father! Hebrews 10:5, talking about this same dynamic. The sacrifice and offering. And whether you desire it, whether He desired it. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 5. Wherefore, when He comes into the world, He says, sacrifice and offering you didn't desire, but a body you prepared for me. Now this is talking about Jesus. Jesus is the one that came into the world and says, sacrifices and offerings you didn't desire, but a body you prepared for me. And what it's talking about is Jesus coming to the conclusion that God never wanted sacrifices and offerings for man, that it was never about that, but that God wanted to provide a sacrifice for man. And that's what Jesus sees when He starts looking into the Scriptures, right? You never wanted something from man. You wanted to provide man with something because you were wanting to be their God. You were wanting to be their Father. And so when you look at the sacrifices and offerings in the Old Testament, it's never God wanting something from us. It's never Him wanting us to give Him something. It's about God desiring to provide Himself to the people so that we could be healed by His life. It was actually God. All the sacrifices in the Old Testament, you know, Peter calls the Old Testament scriptures a word of prophecy. And so the sacrifices and the offerings in the Old Testament were God prophesying to everyone that He will provide Himself a lamb. He will shed His own blood to redeem His people from death. If you want to be the God of a people who are dead in sin, do you know the only way you can be a God of a people who are dead in sin? Is if you enter into the world and you take their sin and death into yourself. It's if you come and stand in the gap. We used to say that, right? We're standing in the gap. As if you come and stand in the gap and take the sin and death that is wounding your people into your own self so that you could deliver them from sin and death. In order to be the God of a people, you'd have to deliver them. That's what makes you their God. And if these people are dead in sin, that's what they're needing to be delivered from. And so God come to demonstrate that He's our God, that He's our Father, by coming into the earth and providing Himself as the Lamb, by shedding His own blood that can now deliver us from the sin and death that was bruising us. And Jesus sees that's what it's all about. You don't desire a sacrifice from them, you desire to provide yourself as a sacrifice. And so God, He knows He's our God, but we're not seeing Him as our God, and we're not seeing Him as our people. We're not seeing ourselves as His people. And so He feels compassion for us. He sees us being bruised with death, and He wants to care for our lives. He wants to serve us with life. He wants us to know He's the Father that we need. So what He did, and this is what Jesus says, a body you have prepared for me. That's what He says. You never desire to sacrifice an offering for them, but you desire to prepare a body for me, right? And so what God did was He prepared a body for His Word. Jesus is His Word. John says the Word is God. And so God prepared a body for His Word because that's the only way God could offer up His own body to be broken. And He did that. He prepared a body for His Word so that in Him offering up His own body to be broken, He could remove the reign of death and pour out of Himself His life. He wanted there to be meat in His house. He wanted there to be something in His house, a table that could be filled with a meat that could feed his people with life. And so he prepares a table for us. And on the table is his own body, broken for us, oozing with life, oozing with healing from sin and death, so that we could feast on that table and that we could be healed and refreshed by his life.